In this lesson, we're going to get data from a database using the Entity Framework. The objectives for this lesson are to add the Entity Framework to our project, add some data annotations to the product class, create a DbContext class to read data from SQL Server, read the data from the product table. To use the Entity Framework, we install the package into our Web API project. The package is Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQL Server. We then add some data annotations to our product class to line that up with the table in our database. So we'll add a table attribute, a key attribute, a required attributes, and a few others. We're also going to create a DbContext class that will help us interact with our SQL Server tables, and we'll add a connection string to our app settings file. Let's take a look at adding the Entity Framework to our project. Before we start adding the Entity Framework, let's remove the weather forecast. We don't need that anymore. And the weather forecast controller. Let's comment out the security, the authorize here, so we don't have to worry about security and all of that. Now let's go ahead and right mouse click on our project and manage NuGet packages. And let's browse for Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQL Server. Click on that one and make sure it supports your version of .NET, and go ahead and install that. Let's now add the appropriate data annotations to our product class so the class will line up with the table in SQL Server. Open your product.cs, and what we're going to do is we're going to add the table attribute. The first name is the table name, and then you add the parameter schema and tell it what schema it's located in. I'm going to be using the AdventureWorks Lite database. It's a sample database that comes from Microsoft. You can get it from them, or you can download it from my GitHub. And we're going to add a couple of usings up here, these system.componentModel data annotations and data annotations.schema. That's where these different attributes that we're going to be using here come from. On the properties, we start decorating with what is special about the products in the SQL Server. For example, the product ID is required because it's our primary key, and it is a database-generated identity. Now, the name property is actually required because it's marked as not nullable in our table. Same with the product number, the standard cost. Now, the standard cost is also a decimal type, and it's 18,2 as far as the scalability. Same thing with the list price, and the weight is now a decimal of 8,2. The cell start date is also required, as well as the row GUID and the modified date. Now the row GUID, the column name is all lowercase, but I really like to use uppercase for my property names. So I've changed this and said, let's add the column attribute here and say this is what the name is in SQL Server, but then we can make the C# property whatever we want. We're going to create a DbContext class, and we're going to inherit from that DbContext class as a way to interact with our tables in our database. So we'll create a public class, AdventureWorks Lite DbContext, that inherits from DbContext, which comes from that package that we just installed into our project. Through this class, we then map entities and relationships to tables in our database, and we then use this DbContext class for all of our CRUD logic. Within this DbContext class, we create a DbSet property for each table in our database. So for example, we just got done annotating the product class, so we would do DbSet product as a generic, and then set the name of the property products, and that's where we'll read the data from, and we will then do our adds, edits, and deletes. If we had a customer object, we would do the same thing to map that to a customer table in our database. We then interact with these DbSet properties, right, to do all of our CRUD logic. Let's add an Entity Framework DbContext class to our Web API project. Right mouse click on the project and let's add another folder. This one we'll call Models. We'll right click on Models and we'll add a class called AdventureWorks Lite DbContext. Click Add, and into this we are going to add this code. So first off, we've got our public partial class AdventureWorks Lite DbContext that inherits from DbContext. we have a constructor into which some options are sent. We just send those options right on down to the base class. You then see on line 14 a public DbSetProduct products. So that's our property we're going to interact with. And there is an override on model creating. Not exactly necessary, but you might find some things that you might do in here. So I like just having it there in case I need it later on. Let's then open our app settings.development.json. And at the very top here, let's add connection strings. And that contains another object which has default connection and then our connection string that gets us to our database. Now you're going to have to change your server name maybe. The database should be AdventureWorks Lite for this particular course. Trusted_connection is true. Multiple active result sets true. Trust the server certificate is true. And I always like putting the application name in as well, but feel free to use whatever connection string works for your particular environment. It's a good idea to add the DbContext to our dependency injection services, so let's go do that now. Open the Service Extensions class and add a couple using statements up here at the top. And then let's add a new method called configure AdventureWorks DB. This again extends the service collection. And we're going to pass in the connection string to this particular method. And this one then sets up our DbContext into dependency injections. In the services collection, there's an add DbContext method. You pass in the class name of your DbContext, and the options would be options.use SQL Server, passing in your connection string. Now, if you're using Oracle or some other database, there will be corresponding methods that you can use for this configuration. Next, we open up our program, and what we're going to do is call that new method now, builder.services.configure AdventureWorks DB, and we will pass in then builder.configuration.getConnectionString default connection. So again, Microsoft has built into the configuration object a getConnectionString, so it knows where to read it, and by default, it does read it out of connection strings, default connection. And we're almost ready now to start doing this. All we need to do is change our product repository class to read data now using that DbContext, and then we'll be able to get products from a database. Open the product repository class, and let's add a private read-only AdventureWorks Lite DbContext, and it's called _DbContext. Set up a constructor so that that can be injected and set. And then what we're going to do here is under the get method, where before I had all this hard-coded data, we're going to wipe all of that out. And we're now simply going to do _DbContext.products.orderBy. We're going to use this lambda expression to order by the name, and we're going to convert that to a list. That will then go out to the database and grab our data. Let's go ahead and now try this out. So we'll run this. Come down here to the Get API product. We execute. It goes out to SQL Server. And it returns now all of the data from our products table instead of the hard-coded data that we had before. Let's change the other method that allows us to get a single product from the database. Open up the getID method here, and this time instead of getting all the data and then applying a where clause, we're now going to go after our DbContext.products.where, passing in the same where clause where the product ID is equal to the ID passed into this method, and then we apply the first or default. The difference is we don't want to go get them all and then do the where clause on the client side. This will actually send the appropriate SQL statement down. Select asterisk from products where product ID equals ID, and that way you would just get a single row back. And again, we should try this out by running this. We'll come down and click on the get here with the product ID, and we'll type in a valid ID, execute, it goes to the database, and it returns our single row. In this lesson, we added the entity framework to our project. We created a DbContext class to read and update data from SQL Server. We injected that DbContext class into our dependency injection services, and we return data from the product table in SQL Server. Coming up next, adding, editing, deleting, and validating data.